A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning and good evening to those who are joining us on Zoom from Australia, India, Ghana, United Kingdom, New Zealand, United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong, Rwanda, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, Thailand, Nigeria, and of course, from Sri Lanka. We extend a warm welcome to the panel discussion, which is the climax of the symposium. This year, our panel discussion theme is optimizing use and minimizing misuse of public-private partnerships in developing countries. The panel discussion is organized by the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, which is well known as CIB Working Commission W122 on Public-Private Partnership, the University of Moratuwa, and the Ceylon Institute of Builders. Today, we are privileged to have a group of esteemed panelists who are experts in public-private partnerships in particular and procurement in the construction sector. In general, each panelist will share relevant insights in the construction sector, as well as their research and industry experience to contribute to a timely and fruitful outcome, making an unforgettable milestone in the 12th World Construction Symposium in 2024. This panel discussion is conducted in hybrid mode. Our live participants are with us at Taj Samudra Hotel, Colombo, Sri Lanka, and also people are joining online from different parties in different worlds via Zoom platform. To conduct the panel discussion, I graciously invite Joint Coordinator, CIB W122 on Public-Private Partnership, Honorary Professor, the University of Hong Kong and University of Moratuwa, Professor Mohan Kumaraswamy. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lakshita, and welcome to this panel discussion, which we hope to make a milestone for all of you. So, as I put on top, the aim of this panel discussion, which I'm supposed to convey briefly, well, simply summarize, it is already in the theme itself. The theme, as was just told to you, is optimizing use and minimizing misuse of public-private partnerships in developing countries. Now, okay, small typo to start with. Even 30 years ago, that should be 30. Even 30 years ago, in researching into BOTs in particular and PPP in general, the potential for good outcomes were seen side by side with the potential for bad outcomes or not so good outcomes, if you want to be polite. So this is based on the potential strengths and the possible weaknesses in PPPs. So my own first paper on PPP was the uses and abuses of BOT, published in the Engineer Journal here in Sri Lanka, Institution of Engineers. Now, some approaches have improved over the last 30 years in some countries. Note the emphasis on the slide. Not much has changed in terms of basics in almost all countries. Hence the need for today's theme. That is why we are still talking about the same thing, even 30 years after I wrote the paper with a similar topic. So maybe the issues are a little different. We are better in general, but there's still a ground level misunderstanding of what PPPs can and cannot do, what they should and what they should not do. Some think it's a way of pulling in easy money. And you might think that is from the public sector side, or to be blunt, from the politician side. They think it's a way of pulling in, well, some think it's a way of pulling in easy money. Or some think it's a way of making easy money. Now, who would think that? Talking about the other side, there should be no other side because they are partners, but there is the private sector. So some companies with good contacts, with good networks might think they can get the job easily. Unfortunately, even on unsolicited bids, as if I may say so, was even pointed out in the ILO report in our own country, where I'm talking from, in the 2023 ILO report, which was less than a year ago. So it's not a way of making money. It's not a way of pulling in easy money. It is about value for money. As the speaker from Indonesia, our first panel member, will be talking about value for money. It's about value for money, about pooling resources and partnerships with a purpose. And as the bottom line shows, if you can see it here in the audience, it's about synergizing strengths and compensating for weaknesses. So what do you mean by the strengths of the private sector, the strengths of the public sector? They have strengths, but they also have weaknesses. You can imagine what they are, right? So they have strengths, they have certain resources, there are efficiencies on one side, maybe less than efficient on the other side, not all. So, and also the financial resource, the access to money and so on. So they're supposed to put together their strengths and compensate for the weaknesses of each other in each partner and work as a team. So that is the basic purpose of this seminar, of this panel discussion, which we call the whole thing. So since we are trying to run to time, I will not talk about Sri Lanka because there are two live present with us today. Panel members will talk about Sri Lanka. But I just need to say something about CIB W22 that partnered with WCS, the World Construction Symposium, to arrange this panel discussion. I thank Dr. Rohan Karunaratne and the CIOB team, and of course the University of Moratuwa did a lot of hard work to get this going. Now, the person who's going to talk to you next is Professor Akintoye. You see him if you're in the room, or if you see him on Zoom, you see him in the Zoom screen. So he's Dean of School of Built Environment, Engineering and Computing at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds. He holds the chair of Construction, Economics and Management. Well, it was Professor Akintola and I who proposed and launched the PPP task group, which was a task group, then TG72 in 2008, going back many years. This was elevated to a working commission after we proved that we could do something better. W122, which is the name of this panel discussion, as one of the organizers. In 2016, we were a working commission. The other person who's not here, but you will see he's on the top row, the third, you can't see it very clearly, but I think they'll put up a slide later, is Giovanni Migliaccio. So he's based in University of Washington, Seattle, and he's the chair of Department of Construction Management there, holds endowed professorship. And he joined Akin and me as a joint coordinator of CIB W122 in 2016. Now, I'm just going to briefly say the two experts who are going to talk to us from overseas after Akin, they're published widely on PPPs. I'll mention them, but you see their faces on the screen. Research Professor Andreas Wibowo from Indonesia is going to give an important talk on something I mentioned, using the value for money criterion to identify PPable. What they say is it a bankable project? Is it a PPable? All projects are not suitable for PPP. So what is the value for money criterion we use to differentiate between those that are good for PPP and not good for PPP? With examples from Indonesia. Associate Professor Yongjian K will talk from Australia. He will be giving a very timely talk on the new PPP mechanism in China, which just came into force. So they've been doing BOTs, PPPs for a long time. And last year, they altered the way they were doing things, and they have got a new way, which a lot of people don't know. So Yongjian is going to give us a hot insight into that, how they're doing it in China, and maybe we can learn some lessons. But he did warn me that you cannot do exactly as China does for certain reasons. He might add that later. The Sri Lanka-based speakers who are at the head table are Nissanka Wijeratne, engineer Nissanka Wijeratne, who will set the scene for the procurement landscape in Sri Lanka and the current deterrents to investments, whether local private sector or funds coming from FDIs, which everyone talks about. What is discouraging them from coming in? So he's talking more general, which I think is necessary to set the scene on procurement. And I know the CIOB people will be very interested to hear this. And I've seen his slides, and believe me, it's worth listening to and watching. Chanaka De Silva, the other speaker from Sri Lanka, is a President's Council, and he's got a long experience with PPPs. He's been involved with them from the time they started in Sri Lanka. So he'll talk on the Sri Lanka experience from the legal and project financing sides. So that's all from me. I will very briefly introduce the speakers when they start. I've already introduced Akin. So can we now switch the focus to Professor Akintola Akintoye, so he can, my fellow coordinator from the UK, who will then give his presentation. He will give a perspective from developed countries to just, for comparison, because we're talking mainly about developing, but he'll talk about developed. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this opportunity to address these the delegates. Sorry I couldn't join you for this event, but this is an opportunity for me to say a few things about my understanding of public-private partnership, particularly in developed countries. And also, I want us to look at it this way, whether we can use PPP to drive economic growth. That is where I'm coming from. And I know that many, many countries, they are looking for economic growth. Whether you are a developed country or developing country, you are trying to achieve that. And we know that in the UK, with the new Labour government, they are looking at economic growth to be able to drive the economy. And how do they do that? And what will be the position of the private sector? And when we talk about economic growth, there are a few things that we are talking about. We are talking about how to increase physical capital goods. And also, we are talking in terms of the technological improvement and advancement, growing the labor force and increase human capital. And that is what economic growth is all about. And how can we use public-private partnership to be able to achieve that, to be able to drive economic growth? And the question I'm trying to ask us is that, can PP help in any way to drive economic growth? That is to say, to deliver the investment, development, and services that are essential to boost economic growth and recovery. So what I've been trying to talk about is about the fact that we can use that in terms of the growth, in terms of the economic growth. Can we use PPP to achieve economic growth? And that is the question I want us to look into. And I said, it doesn't matter where you are, whether developed or developing country. We need to look for economic growth. And the UK government, the new Labour government, that is what they are looking into in terms of what can we achieve and how do we achieve that? And how can we bring a situation where people can benefit from the infrastructure that is available? And also, if you look at some of these challenges that we have, over the years, many countries, they've used, whether developed or developing countries, they've used PPP to leverage private investment in terms of upgrading of infrastructure, rehabilitation, and maintenance of infrastructure. That has been used over the years. But for many developed countries, it's as if they are moving away from that. They are looking for something else. And as mentioned by Mohan, all this happened a long time ago, about 30 years ago, when the development around infrastructure started. A lot of people, a lot of countries were using the private investment to be able to gain the necessary investment needed. But presently, things have changed. And rather, what governments are looking for is around efficiency. They are looking at alternative ways, particularly in developed countries, to be able to gain the same investment. In the UK now, most of what they are looking at is joint venture, in terms of equity joint venture between the private and the public sector. And it's also part of the wider market initiative of government. They think that they can borrow more money, at a cheaper rate, and also the economy also is improving in some of those countries. And these are the kind of challenges that we need to look into. But having said that, in many developing countries, PPP is still very useful. And even the World Bank and the IMF, they are encouraging that as a way of gaining infrastructure, getting the right infrastructure that people will need. So we need to be able to start looking at the developments around public-private partnership from developed and developing countries. Things are no longer the same. There are changes that we need to recognize. And this is precisely what this is all about. And I want us, as part of this discussion, is to look at what aspect of economic growth can we use public-private partnership to achieve. And if you look at the Labour government, the energy policy of new Labour government, where they are trying to make sure around the renewable energy, how can they use the private sector? They are putting things in place to make it, to ensure that the environment is viable for the private sector to be able to engage with their the energy policy of Labour government. And they are trying to get a lot of money from the private sector on onshore and offshore wind energy. And that is what this Labour government is trying to do. And at the same time, we have the local authorities. If I quickly share this. In fact, I recommend this if you have time for you to be able to look at this in terms of what the local government authority are doing. Again, they are short of money, obviously, but they are looking at how private sector can be brought in. This is in the UK. The council are exploring how PPP as an investment option could be used to unlock a range of social, environmental, and economic benefit aligned to local and national priorities. So they've developed a kind of guidelines that they need to follow to be able to achieve that. They have about 7 steps already put in place for the local authorities, for them to be able to have the necessary money they need for investment. And these are some of the challenges they have. If you look at some of the context that brought this about, number one is the constraint on public finance post-COVID. There's a problem there where you need more investment. Number two, housing and regeneration. Government, they need to build more accommodation. Many of you might have been to London. You see it's very, very expensive. They need a lot of houses. The same thing, every local authority in the UK, they need housing. So they think that bringing in the climate, the private sector can help with that. Also, we have the climate crisis, fuel poverty, town center renewal as well. The town center are in a very serious situation where they are run down, really. They need investment in the city centers, in the town centers. So they are looking at all this, and they are thinking that private sector can help, and also supporting local recovery and growth as well, which I've already mentioned. So these are all going. This is an example of how they want to use public-private partnership in the UK, different from the way it has been used before in terms of infrastructure development. But when you look at many developing countries, there is still need for a lot of investment. We are talking around water, around road, around rail. So there is a lot that can be done in developing countries by bringing in private sector to help, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of efficiency of those infrastructure, and also to be able to leverage the resources that is available in the private sector. So all this we need to consider together when we are trying to look at public-private partnership development in developed countries and in developing countries. There are different reasons that they are now needing for them to be able to develop that. I think I will finish by just saying the summary of that particular report that I've mentioned. They mentioned that PPP can play an important role in delivering key assets, infrastructure, and services across the UK. So it's not as if it has been abandoned, but it's being used in a different way around economic growth, around regeneration, around housing development by local authorities. So it's going to be used differently. And also they mentioned some of those issues that have been mentioned. They mentioned the fact that resources and preparation are required by all partners as well. Again, the private sector and the public sector, they might be working differently. How do you build partnership between those organizations for them to be able to fulfill and realize the opportunities that public-private partnership can provide? These are some of those challenges. I think I want to stop there. I'm sure we can look at that when we come to the panel discussion. But what I want us to take home is the fact that can we use PPP to drive economic growth in developed and developing countries? I stop there. Thank you.
Can I talk? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Akin, for that very insightful, packed presentation. Sorry, we could give you only that amount of time, but it was very, very valuable. Thank you very much, Akin, and do stay on.
Okay,
because yeah, thank you. We'll be having Q&A. Talking of Q&A, I noticed some questions are coming on chat already. I didn't give the ground rules, but the ground rules, please, questions can be asked live, of course, later when we come to the Q&A session, as well as on chat, and we'll have to sort them out and see. We want to enable as many questions as possible. So with that objective, please, I request you to ask your question in one sentence or maximum 2 short sentences, please. And before you place your question in chat, of course on live, please state your name and affiliation. If not, the question may not be asked or answered. And then, yeah, okay, I'll just leave it at that, but because I noticed some coming on chat. So, okay, the next, I move on to the next speaker from overseas, Professor Andreas. Wibowo is a research professor and senior lecturer in construction management at Department of Civil Engineering of the Parahyangan Catholic University in Indonesia. He previously served as a head of secretariat for the Agency for Promoting Water Supply Systems and as a principal researcher at the Agency for Research and Development of the Ministry of Public Works and Housing Indonesia. So if you want to see his a little bigger CV, still not big enough for what he has done, but you can, it's in the conference website, in the panel discussion website in the WCS 2024. Over to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Professor Kumaraswamy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Bandung, Indonesia. Let me share my screen. Yes, my name is Andreas Wibowo, and I'm from Parahyangan Catholic University, as introduced by Professor Kumaraswamy. And today I will share with you about the issues and challenges in VFM, or value for money assessment for projects in Indonesia. This is the outline of my presentation, and I will start my presentation with some definition of VFM. There are several definitions of VFM that can be found in the literature, and one of the most widely used definition is those given by the UK Treasury 2006, which defines the VFM as the optimum combination of whole-of-life cost and quality of the goods or services in order to meet the user's requirements. In Indonesia, the VFM is defined as the performance measurement of PPP projects based on the triple-E criteria: economic, efficiency, and effectiveness, as well as the quality of services that can meet the public needs. However, I would like to say that the VFM can also be defined in a simpler word within the context of PPP, which is the cost savings that can be achieved through improved service quality, better allocation, and efficiency gains. There are several approaches that can be used to assess the VFM. First, that we can use the full cost benefit analysis, which is the most complex one, and it is used in Germany, for instance. And the second approach is that we can use the so-called public sector comparator, which I will explain later, and the PPP cost before the private bids are invited. And the third one is that we can use the UK style by comparing the PSC and the PPP cost after the private bids are invited. And the fourth one is that we can rely on a competitive bidding process, which is used in France, for instance. And amongst these approaches, the PSC is the most widely used VFM methodologies. It was first introduced in the UK and then later adopted in Australia, and now has been used by many countries, including in Indonesia. So what the PSC is? The PSC is hypothetical net present cost to the government if the government choose to use the conventional procurement or traditional procurement, where the government will assume all the cost and risk of the projects. The PSC typically consists of four elements. The first one is the raw cost, and then the compensatory and the value of transfer and return risk. This PSC will be compared with the PPP cost, which is a hypothetical net present cost to the government when the government chooses to use a PPP arrangement where the private sector will assume certain risk and cost. The PPP cost typically consists of two elements. The first is the cost of service payments made by the government to the private sector and the value of the return risk. The government will expect, of course, that their PPP arrangement will provide them with VFM or cost saving. And it happens when the PPP cost is lower than those of the traditional procurement, which is reflected by the public sector comparator. In Indonesia, the VFM test has been mandatory actually since 2015, and Indonesia, in fact, adopted the second approach by comparing the PSC cost and the PPP cost before the private bids are invited. And the use of the PSC model was formalized last year, actually, 2023, and it is similar to the PSC cost of the Australian model. Although it was formalized in 2023, it has been used for years since 2015. I did some survey of the VFM assessments based on several outline business cases and final business cases, which were prepared from 2017 that I will share with you. And based on this, my survey, that most of the business cases demonstrated positive VFM, while two had negative VFM, which is quite uncommon actually. And the median values of VFM is about 15% of the PSC, or if you use the mean values, is about 22% of the PSC. These are several key findings of my survey, but I will not go deeper into these findings, but instead I will jump to the several issues and challenges. I will focus on a few things to the given times. The first issue is that there is no agreement on how can we select the discount rate. Should we use, for instance, single or different rate for PSC and PPP cash flow? And what discount rate should be used to evaluate the VFM assessment, whether it is weighted average cost of capital, whether it is risk-free discount rate or social discount rate? And what methodology should be used to estimate discount rates? The second issue is that how can we quantify the risk? What kind of risk can be included into the public sector comparator, and how the parameters of the risk can be estimated? The third issue deals with omniscient bias, I would say, because most business cases often assume that the government has no capability to mitigate the risk. Well, on the other hand, the private sector is assumed to have perfect risk mitigation capability, which is not necessarily correct. One of the main challenges is that we, Indonesia, is faced with limited data availability and insufficient expertise in quantitative risk analysis, which is required for the PSC construction. The problem is, if these issues are not properly addressed, the VFM assessment can be misused just to justify a decision that has already been made. How? Because one can easily adopt what I call as a tricky strategies just to make up VFM. For instance, one can incorporate as many risks as possible into the PSC, because as we know that the greater number of the risks included into the PSC will lead to higher PSC and also the VFM. Second approach that the government, we can underestimate the public sector risk mitigation capability, and in the same time, we can overestimate the private sector risk mitigation capability. And the strategy just to make a VFM is that we can use irrelevant sources for risk parameters, which can result in very high risk values. And the fourth one is that one can change the discount rate, because as we know that the VFM is highly sensitive to the adjustment in the discount rates. There are several recommendations that can be offered to the government in developing countries, in particular Indonesia. The government should first that they develop more operational guidelines for VFM methodologies in order to reduce subjectivity and potential misinterpretation, and of course, the misuse of VFM assessment. The second thing that the government should do is that they should enhance the public sector understanding of VFM and its measurement methodology in order to reduce the optimism bias. And the third one is that the government should perform a comprehensive review of expected VFM for projects in the planning and operation stages, and do some ex-post VFM evaluation for projects under construction and operation. And last but not least is that the government should incorporate qualitative and non-financial factors into the decision-making process. I will conclude my session with one open question, actually, whether the PSC is right for developing countries like Indonesia, when the original rationale behind the PSC still failed, especially when the government is required to justify their preference for PPP over the traditional procurement. But the challenge is that the existing methodology is highly theoretical, is quite sophisticated, and it's very complex for developing countries. So the quick question is now then, how can we make it simpler, especially for developing countries, in particular Indonesia? That was my presentation, Professor Kumaraswamy, and I am more than happy to discuss with you in Q&A question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your great presentation, which gave us a good focus on a very important criterion, which has been used and misused. To use the theme of the seminar, you used the word misuse yourself. And even in the UK, well, they had some problems with it long ago. And I don't know whether they got it right. Akintola can tell us later during the Q&A. Well, I know they too put a full stop and they wanted a reset on the PFI. So apart from the report that Akin mentioned, they had another report last year, which was on the reset needed for PFI, because PFI had mixed results. Okay, moving on to the next speaker who is waiting patiently, Yongjian, who works very closely with me on PPP public relations. In fact, there's a book by him on PPP, Body of Knowledge, which is due to be published next year, which is one of the books in my book series, which I mentioned yesterday. So Yongjian is Professor Yongjian Ke is an associate professor of project management in the School of Built Environment at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. He's made a significant contribution to the field of PPPs, being recognized as one of the most influential and cited authors in this area, which is how I got to know him many, many years ago. So over to you, Yongjian. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yongjian Ke. I'm from Australia. Originally from China, I have been doing research on China's PPP for almost 2 decades. The PPP has been very important in China's infrastructure development over the past few decades. However, recent development has introduced substantial changes to how these projects are governed and operated. So today I'm going to talk about these significant changes in China's PPP program, and I hope that it can give you some sort of inspiration. So to understand the current changes is, of course, essential to take a brief look at the history. The PPP journey in China can be divided into 4 distinct stages. From 1984 to 2004, the central government focused on attracting foreign investors through BOT model. And then between 2003 and 2013, the local governments and state-owned companies become the main players in China's PPP project. And when I said state-owned companies becoming a main player, I mean that they are playing a role as private sector, which is extremely different from international PPP experience. And then from 2014, we witnessed a surge in PPP projects, often referred to as the PPP fever. However, this period, we also saw fluctuations and eventually a suspension in 2023. And then finally, in November 2023, the central government launched it called the new PPP mechanisms, marking a significant shift in the landscape. And this is the focus of today's presentation. So let's zoom in on the last decade. This period has been particularly transformative for PPPs in China. We witnessed an unprecedented expansion of PPP projects. As I say, in many academic papers, it refers PPP fever. As we can see on the slides, the characteristics of this fever was marked by a rapid increase in both the numbers and scale of the PPP projects. Within 3 to 4 years, about 80% of county-level local governments had launched PPP projects. And however, this rapid expansion also led to a significant challenge, of course. So in response, the central government introduced measures in 2017 to control the growth of PPPs, resulting in a noticeable slowdown in new projects. And then by 2019, as many of the 2014 and 2015 projects entering their operational phases, issues begin to surface. Thereafter, in February 2023, the central government had to stop temporarily suspend PPP implementations, and then they conduct a sort of a almost 9 months review, and then launch a new PPP mechanism. So the scale of this PPP fever is evident in the numbers. Even for countries as large as China, the numbers are scary. From 2014 to 2022, local governments proposed more than 10,000 PPP projects, and among which 8,488 projects were signed contracts. It's just a crazy number, so we call it PPP fever. So what exactly happened? In the year of, it was published in 2023, but it's the report for 2022. So it was conducted by the National Audit Office of the State Council. So this office randomly reviewed 2,408 PPP projects and found out 158 projects significantly underperformed, and 3 significant projects were identified. The first one is the Ministry of Finance. They have organized or they have maintained a project database called PPP project database. Initially was designed to disclose project information to the general public. Eventually become a prerequisite for projects to be carried on in the market. It means banks only approve loans to projects in the database. So everyone try their best to push the project to the database, and it leads to issues such as non-strict approval, corruptions, resulting in the inclusion of many inappropriate projects. Those projects should not be conducted by PPPs, but local governments want to do PPPs because they consider it as a financing tool instead of infrastructure delivery model. And second, huge financial commitment by local government was another issue. So at that period, PPP were actually open to both user-pays and government-pays projects, but market players prefer government-pays, which pressure local governments into making substantial financial commitments. So they effectively lock in local governments' midterm and long-term debt. And of course, issue happens. Starting in 2019, many local governments were not able to fulfill their payment obligations to PPP projects, leading to financial crisis for a lot of private investors. Then last year, they introduced a new PPP mechanisms. So what are new? First, they have a new leader. In the past, PPP projects were oversight by Ministry of Finance, and then it has shifted from Ministry of Finance to National Development and Reform Commission. This change is aimed at a better aligning PPP project with China's broader infrastructure development arrangements. To some extent, it sends a message to local governments that PPP should be a more considered as a delivery model to develop infrastructures. It could be PPP, non-PPP, EPC, among many others, instead of a pure financing tool, because it's no longer oversight by Ministry of Finance. And another new point is the focus and scope. So now they have explicitly mentioned a focus on projects with operational income, utilize user pays. Government pays are generally not allowed. So governments try to minimize the fiscal commitment by local governments and limited the involvement of state-owned enterprise. So that means they are looking for a higher degree of private involvement. And this new PPP policies explicitly list out projects that should be solely invested by private enterprise, and projects that should have at least 35% of private investments. So what does this mean for stakeholders? With state-owned enterprise playing a smaller role, there are new opportunities for private enterprise and overseas investors to take the lead in PPP projects. However, this requires, of course, a deep understanding of the new guidelines. And with the existing PPP projects that was proposed during the PPP fever, what to continue these projects is another sort of opportunity and challenge, of course. And my personal note here is to never underestimate the innovation of local governments and marketplace. They have shown the ability to create all sorts of PPP projects that serve their interests. In my view, the new PPP mechanisms in China represent a very much more explicit approach, clearly defining what projects can use PPP, outline the acceptable payment regimes, and restricting the involvement of state-owned companies in certain projects. So in conclusion, China's experience with PPP underscores the critical importance of optimizing the use of PPP partnership, but also highlighting the risk of misuse that can arise from unchecked expansion. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yongjian. Excellent as usual. So I will not comment further. We'll just keep you online for the Q&A, which I'm sure there will be a few to you. So let's move on to the first Sri Lanka-based speaker, Engineer Nissanka Wijeratne, who many of you here in the audience may know, but those online may not know yet. You will shortly. He has held several appointments during his career. Example, as Secretary to the Cabinet Ministries of Housing and Construction, as Chairman ICTAD, now SIDA. Since 2015, he is the Secretary General stroke CEO of the Chamber of Construction Industry of Sri Lanka, which is considered the apex representative body of the construction sector. And just for your information, we have another person who wore similar hats, like ex-secretary to Ministry of Housing and Construction and Chairman ICTAD, who wore the same hats, who is online listening. So maybe we'll have a question from him later. Nissanka, please come up to the podium.
Good afternoon. Organizers from UM and CIOB, Professor Mohan and Professor Sandita Sandanayaka, ladies and gentlemen. This afternoon, I will be speaking on construction procurement landscape in Sri Lanka and current deterrents to private investments. In Sri Lanka, the public sector procurement for construction work is governed by the Government Procurement Guideline 2006, which is effective even up to now. This is a development from the guidelines on government tender procedure published in August 1996. This 1996 guideline was published superseding the Financial Regulation Chapter 13, which was applicable from colonial period up to 1996. National Procurement Commission, established under the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, has drafted a new procurement guidelines for goods, works, and services, which is now with the Cabinet of Ministers for final approval. It is observed that there has been many instances of state institutions observing the procurement guidelines 2006 in default. For example, as per guideline 5.4.2, any contract for works exceeding 3 months duration shall include price variation as per SIDA formulae. Due to many instances of non-compliance by state institutions and unprecedented price escalation that took place during that time, a special cabinet decision had to be taken in December 2021 as a result of representation from various associations to allow price variation notwithstanding whether contracts provided price variation or not. With the above backdrop, it would have been much preferable if the new guidelines was named at least as Government Procurement Procedure rather than issue it as guidelines. However, in the IMF Government Diagnostics Assessment on Sri Lanka, it has been recommended to enact a public procurement law, which we feel is a welcome measure to achieve transparency and good governance. With such a law, the proposed guidelines should be enacted as a regulation. With this, any violation of the provision shall be made punishable offense. Apparently, we understand that an ADB-backed team has already drafted a public procurement act and has sent to the National Procurement Commission for further action. But it appears that NPC has given more preference to finalizing the new government procurement guidelines, and efforts by the chamber to get a copy of this document from NPC has not been fruitful yet. And ADB says we have to get from NPC. In addition to above, the construction procurement, both in public and private sectors, for identified construction work shall be subject to the provisions of the Construction Industry Development Act number 33 of 2014. In particular, SPDs published by SIDA shall be used, and also there's a stipulation that identified construction should be undertaken by a contractor registered with SIDA and also a consultant registered with SIDA as qualified persons. As per the CID Act, identified construction work will include all buildings, structures, or landscapes with facilities or amenities for public use in value exceeding rupees 10 million, or needing approval of environmental, geological, and cultural heritage regulatory bodies, except a residential building constructed for personal use of a private owner. This interpretation will be changed with the amendments presently with the legal draftman and enacted to include all construction work in value exceeding 5 million, except a residential building constructed for personal use of a private owner. With this interpretation, it will be seen that the CID Act will apply practically to all construction projects except a private residence. Violation of any provision of CID Act is an offense, punishable on conviction by a magistrate after a summary trial by a fine not exceeding 100,000 or imprisonment up to 2 years or both. So I think we have to take serious note on the provisions of the CID Act when we are embarking on construction projects. Following drawbacks are evident in the present public sector procurement system. No system to publish public procurement data. There's no website or no information portal where the public procurement data is published by all the state sector institutions. No legal deterrent to violation of procurement guidelines and resorting to malpractices. There have been officials and also other parties who have connived with each other in violating the procurement guidelines, but up to now, I think no action has been taken. Procurement committees have no civil society representation. particularly from the CCI, to ensure better transparency. In fact, this is one of the requests we have made for, I think, 4 years, that procurement committee should have a civil representation other than the public officials. Bid evaluations and procurement committees decisions should be completed within a period of not more than 4 months, as longer periods will breed corruption. I think we firmly believe that there should be time limits to finalize the evaluation process and make the determinations. In my view, I think 3 months is more than enough even to evaluate the most complicated procurement. PAB to determine appeals against CAPC decisions is presently appointed by the President. Why can't the NPC, established under the 21st Amendment, undertake this role? The entire PAB process is shrouded in secrecy. I think very recently an incident was highlighted. It came in the newspapers as well, where a tender award to the lowest responsive bidder was overturned by the PAB and the chairman of the PAB and the chairman of the state institution, both the same person. So I mean, a client's CEO should not be hearing appeal against a cabinet appointed tender board decision. Accepting unsolicited proposals with cabinet approval, awarding contracts before the site is fully free of encumbrances. In fact, even I can cite when the Southern Expressway contract was signed, I think not even 75% of the right of way was clear. Speaking on deterrence to private investments, the ambassador of a Western country at an embassy function recently summarized beautifully what is needed to be done to attract more investments. The 3 conditions he stipulated during that speech were minimize corruption, ensure supremacy of law, rule of law, and speedier judicial process, cut down on red tape, and grant approvals expeditiously. Now, let's look at where we stand on Corruption Perception Index, published by the Transparency International, and Ease of Doing Business Index, published by the World Bank, with FDI inflows. You can see countries like Denmark, who ranked first on the CPI, and number 4 on the EDBI, Ease of Doing Business Index, is attracting 27 million, and New Zealand, that is 6.8 of their GDP, and New Zealand is attracting 3.1% of the GDP. They are doing well. And Singapore, very good on both ranks, and 30% of GDP has been attracted as FDI. And Hong Kong, fairly good on CPI and Ease of Doing Business, 13%. Where we stand? We are number 101 on CPI and number 9 on Ease of Doing Business, and we have attracted only 1.2% of the GDP as FDIs in 2022. The latest information is that on the CPI index, we have fallen to 115 in 2023. Now, this figure was in, I think, 2021. So it's a great progress. We have now at 115. So I think even to attract FDIs, I think I would say very productive FDIs, we have to get our house in order by improving the CPI and the EDBI. One method to cut down corruption and delays in approvals is to make the approval process, is to digitize the approval process. In Singapore, all building applications are needed to be applied online, and the approval process will not take more than 10 days. There is hardly any human contact in this process. Though there is supposed to have a one-stop process even in Sri Lanka, still you need to get clearance from nearly 17 statutory authorities. And one will be lucky to get these at least within 3 months, but I would say it normally takes about 6 months. And I know there had been instances that took as long as 3 years to get the development permit due to no fault of the developer's plans. To ensure issue of development permit within 28 days, which was in the election manifesto of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Presidential Commission on Simplification of Laws and Regulations in June 2021 proposed a statutory mechanism by establishing a committee comprising of all relevant statutory authorities amending the UDA Act. The Commission even submitted the detailed amendment for this. Actually, this amendment was vetted by 2 President Councils who were in that commission. But sadly to this date, no action is taken. I will cite 4 examples of investment proposals that did not materialize due to red tape and possibly corruption in the system. 1,200 megawatt LNG power plant with LNG offloading platform with an investment of $1.3 billion submitted in response to a RFP call for industrial developments in Hambantota port. In spite of a cabinet approval given in 2013, this project did not take off due to various red tape. The developers, a British company based in Hong Kong, offered to sell electricity at US cents 7 with no capacity charge. A Swedish investor's proposal to produce 7 megawatts from the garbage dump at Mithapamulla by scientifically managing the dump. Electricity was to be sold at the same rate as rooftop solar. If this was implemented, the disaster that happened with the collapse of the dump could have been avoided. Why it failed was any authorities failed to give a lease of the site on which the dump is because of various other reasons. Sitawaka hydropower project proposed by the CCI on a boot basis. CCI was not even called for a project discussion because we specifically said we can pay commissions to anybody. Proposal by Sultan of Qatar to develop one of the islands of Kalpitia as a tourism resort with improvements made to the road from Katunayaka to Kalpitia. In fact, Sultan himself came to Sri Lanka and made this offer, but nothing happened. In my view, one factor that was instrumental in corruption and much economic loss is the projects approved on unsolicited proposals. If you compare the cost of expressways, it will be very clear that the contracts awarded on competitive bids were much less costly than the unsolicited ones. We should insist on always inviting competitive bids, if necessary, limiting the tenderers from the particular country providing funds. Containing corruption has to start from the top. Since 1950s, 1957, no parliamentarian has been punished for bribery and corruption. In 1957, there was this famous Walter Thalgoda Commission, and 4 MPs were punished as a result. But after that, no parliamentarian has been taken to task. And in fact, in the present parliament, we have an MP who had been found guilty on a murder charge, and there's another MP who is found guilty on a corruption charge. Both are in the parliament still, but in public sector you can't have that. Even on a prima facie case, you are interdicted, but not with the parliament, because they have the power to make laws and unmake laws. Chamber of Construction Industry of Sri Lanka has published in their monthly bulletin in July a set of minimum policy commitments from the presidential candidates to improve construction industry and investment climate. If anyone of you have not seen or received the construction bulletin, you can access that at the website given here, that is www.ccisrilanka.org. So that gives the 23 policy commitments we have asked from the presidential candidates. Thank you very much. I'll be ready to answer any questions during the Q&A time.
Thank you very much, Engineer Nissanka Wijeratne, for that very informative presentation. Some things that are known to some of us, but are not said in public. So I congratulate you for saying some things. There are more to be said, of course. I mentioned the IMF report. The page, if anyone is interested, it's accessible. Pages 61 to 69 of the IMF report goes into little detail with examples of what Engineer Nissanka was talking about, with specific projects, including one on PPP on page 61. So unsolicited proposals in general and on PPP, and it gets worse. So those are there. Those 9 pages are talking about those things in more detail. So it's public. Okay, next over to, we are running a bit late on time, and I don't know, smiles from the back. Is it very late? We need to leave time for Q&A. So Yasangaka, you can tell me how much time we have left. After Chanaka De Silva PC finishes his presentation. He's a leading legal expert in project finance transactions and negotiations in Sri Lanka. He's a founder partner of Nitya Partners. Before that, he was in the Aegis department, as I know. For over 35 years, Mr. De Silva has been involved in advising, negotiating, and structuring major infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, including advice on the structuring and implementing the earliest PPPs in Sri Lanka. So may I invite Chanaka to take over and dive deep into PPPs from the general procurement landscape that was conveyed to us by Nissanka. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Unlike the other presenters, I do not have a presentation available. So I will speak, and I invite you to listen. In view of the limited time that I have, I will go directly into the topic. So a brief history about PPPs in our country. Our present trend towards PPPs started around 1995. And the very first project that was handled was a power project, which was called the Asia Power Project. It was a 60 megawatt power project. And we started around 1994, if I remember correct. And we negotiated for a very long time because it was a very long learning cycle for everybody involved in that project. We took 3 years to negotiate that transaction, and we did that transaction. Happily today, the project is concluded. It has run its cycle. and it had no problems in implementation at all. And since then, we have done several projects in several sectors, some very large, some quite large, some small ones. In a recent seminar, which I was in a workshop, which I was participating, it was said that in Sri Lanka, there have been 88 PPPs which have been done. I myself have been involved in many of them, probably all the large ones, some for the government, some for the private sector, some for financiers. So I'm quite familiar with all aspects relating to these projects. And we have many projects in the electricity sector. We have 4 large projects in the port sector, and we have some in the water sector. And there are smaller projects in different sectors, including the electricity sector. So we are quite comfortable with these transactions by now, having started in 1995, coming up to now. Now, in this context, very often, one aspect that you hear is that we don't have a PPP law. So how do you do a PPP transaction? My simple question is, when you do something, anything, do you have to have a law to do it? When you build a house, do you need a law to build a house? When you set up a school, do you have to have a law to set up a school? No, that is unnecessary. Our law is very robust. And I told you that we have done very large projects up to now. SAGT is one of them. The Western Container Terminal is one of them. CICT is one of them. We also did Hambantota Port. They're very large projects. We have done numerous electricity transactions. 300 megawatt projects, 125 megawatt projects. Many of them have run their term. Now, how did we do this? These were done under our existing law. And our existing law is robust enough. We have had a Supreme Court in our country since 1801. And laws are not something which is unknown to us. Our law of contract is very well known. The position of the government and what the government can do and what the government cannot do is also very well known. For instance, when we did the very first PPP in the electricity sector, the very first question, I was in the government at the time, that I had to answer was, can we do a PPP in our country? And if you looked at the law at that time, our law was so advanced that the law was structured on the basis that you could have a person with a generation license, a person with a distribution license, and a person with a transmission license. And each of them were to be independently handled. So that structure was there in the 1960s and before that. Of course, we went and complicated it by putting the CEB in place. But we like to complicate things and we do that, right? But still, the law was available for us to do that. We could do the port transactions without any additional legislation being brought in. Our law is robust enough to handle this kind of transactions. So, next aspect. What are the other aspects that are necessary for the transactions to be done? See, one thing that was done right in 1994, when this whole process was started, was that the government at that time identified that if we were going to do PPPs or project finance transactions, you need specialists who knew this job. So therefore, they set up a unit. It was originally under the Ministry of Finance. It was called SIDI, Secretariat for Infrastructure Development and Investment. Then it was converted to the BII, Bureau of Infrastructure Investment, which was under the BOI. It was directly functioning under the president in both instances. Later on, we had the NAPPP, and unfortunately, thereafter, the NAPPP was removed, stopped. And we had a very wobbly period for PPPs. And now they're resurrecting that again. Why do you need an agency of this nature? You need an agency of this nature because these are delicate transactions. You require expert knowledge, and you can't have expert knowledge everywhere. And if the government was going to do it, it makes sense for you to have these people with the expertise in one place available to assist all government agencies. So that's what happened at CD. That's what happened at BII. That is why at that period, lots of transactions of the PPP nature were done. So many electricity projects were done. SAGT was done. And they happened to be some of the best projects, best foreign investment transactions that were done. Of course, it is not as if there is no criticism in those. There is. Sometimes you say that these are too expensive. Yes, it can be. That might be valid criticism. But we must also understand one aspect. You can't compare transactions done in countries like ours with the costs of other countries. You can't compare a project in Sri Lanka with a project that is done in the US. Impossible. Because people won't come to, an investor from the US won't come and invest here if he was getting the same return in the US. Why should he? These are very simple, logical stories, simple, logical answers. You come here, your investment rate is higher. So your interest rate is higher. And then you require people to have a better investment return. And then obviously your product is going to be expensive. Now, on the other hand, the next criticism is, okay, this would be cheaper if we hired it, if we did it directly. Probably yes. No private sector comes to invest without a profit. And we know that. Even a construction contractor gets profit. Government, of course, does not have a profit motive. So if you compare what the government is procuring and what is being delivered by the private sector, obviously, there is going to be a difference in pricing. The question is that increase that we are paying worth it or not? Now, why do we do that? If we had the money to put it up, we would have done it by ourselves. But the reason why we go and do to the private sector is for the reason, very often, the requirement for that infrastructure is there, the requirement for that investment is there, but we do not have the money to do it. Or the money must be sourced towards some other aspect. And of course, when the private sector gets involved, the efficiency is higher because they manage their resources better. The best example is the PPP transaction, which is in the port, which is SAGT, and Jaya Container Terminal, which we are doing. Jaya Container Terminal has a larger footprint. It was there for longer. SAGT has a smaller footprint. But if you look at how they are performing, I think last year, SAGT did 200 TEUs. They have modern equipment. They are more efficient. Check the internet. I'm sure you can get that information. Jaya Container Terminal, government establishment did 1.6, having a larger footprint, 1.96, 400,000 TEUs less than SAGT. They have more space, but their equipment is older. They find it more difficult to go and procure stuff. Now, this is the comparison that we have. Side by side, two similar projects, one PPP, one which is not. I'm not saying that this is a complete example. This is not the result of a study, but this is what you see. You see this even in the generation facilities. Go and look at some of the generation facilities, electricity generation facilities that have been done under PPPs. How efficiently they are run, how efficiently they are maintained in comparison to the CB. But of course, I must say, CB is also, although there is a lot of criticism, a place which is fairly well managed, fairly well handled, right? Then, financing. When we did the original projects, it was very difficult to find financiers in Sri Lanka. Our local financiers were very reluctant to get into that space. But today, if you look at many of the projects, the financing comes locally. And that is definitely a step in the right direction. They have looked at these projects. They know how to analyze them. They are, in fact, even more happier to take some of the local risks than international financiers are. And that's an exciting trend. And they're happy to get together and lend money. And if you look at the last few projects that have come along, it is actually the local banks that have been financing the power sector. Port sector is a very large project. I don't think the Sri Lankan banks have really got involved in, let's say, the Western Container Terminal project. But in the power sector, the Sri Lankan banks are very, very much involved. Then, so what is the story? What is our experience up to now? If you look at our experience up to now, we have apparently done 88 projects, but even if you look at the larger projects, most of them, the earlier ones, have actually ended. Their term has ended. 20, 25 years have gone. The projects have functioned well. Firstly, the projects did not fail. The projects that were implemented did not fail. Number two, the disputes that were there were resolved very, very conveniently and speedily. Now, if you look at the position in India, they had disastrous projects. They had projects like Enron, which went completely wrong. But fortunately for us, our experience was better. It was better because at the time they were entered into, they were better managed. Now the next, which is always spoken of, is the sharing of risk. In these PPP transactions, I think the previous speakers also alluded to this, there is a certain amount of risks that are taken by the state or the state is asked to take. Now, in relation to that, two questions need to be addressed. Number one, if it was handled by the public sector in the first instance, would they not have carried that risk anyway? Secondly, if you ask the private sector to bear that risk, what would have been the cost of asking the private sector to bear that risk? Would it not have increased the product cost more? Thirdly, even though the government took over the risk, did we see those risks materialize? Did we see those risks materializing, and did they result in an actual cost? Because very often, these risks that the government is asked to take up are risks which do not normally materialize. So therefore, paying a real cost for them upfront perhaps does not make economic sense very often. I am, please understand, within 10 minutes trying to present to you a sort of a snapshot of the situations. Then, what is the position with regard to the future? What do we need to do, or what do we need to address in relation to the future? I would advert to two aspects. Number one, when you are doing PPP transactions, you can't do these transactions willy-nilly, as we say. You need to pay attention to them. The transactions must be very precisely structured because these are delicate transactions. If you don't structure them, you are not going to attract the big players, the good players into the market. You will only get those guys who are willing to tinker with the markets and adjust their risks. And they're not the people that we want. So structuring of the project at the procurement stage is critical. And something that I have seen often is that these projects are not appropriately structured. Very often the documentation which comes out now appears to be tinkered and structured in particular ways, which makes it suboptimal to go to the market. And there have been instances where, as a result of that, there were no bidders. No one made a bid. I can give you examples of projects. No one bidded because you could not do that project on that basis. Number one. Number two, our processes of handling these projects must be streamlined. In other words, we need to have proper procurement processes for the purpose of evaluating them, for the purpose of selecting, for the purpose of negotiating. We also need to have processes which are set down about how to handle unsolicited proposals. Unsolicited proposals, whether you like it or not, will come. And some of those proposals are very good. And if you do handle them properly, and if you do take them forward properly, very good projects result from that. In fact, there was one project very recently where a tender was going on and an unsolicited proposal came parallelly. I won't mention what the project is, a very well-known project. In fact, the criticism of the unsolicited proposals was, why are you doing it? There is a tender going on. You might even know what I'm talking about. But do you know what happened in that? The tendered price, the combined tendered price was double the price of the unsolicited proposal. Double, exactly double. Right? So if in that event, if the government did not look at the unsolicited proposal, that would have been a crime, a national crime. So I don't think there is anything wrong in looking at unsolicited proposals, evaluating them properly, and seeing whether it can be adopted to our benefit or not. We don't have to put an embargo on them. We need to have a proposal or a mechanism or methodology properly established to deal with that. And I think my time is up and I'm open for questions at any time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're starting at the Q&A. At the time, we were supposed to finish the Q&A. So I think we can ask for a grace period of 15 minutes. So you know that we are on a very tight schedule. Well, all construction is. So I'd like to take a couple of questions from the chat, which we have got and sort of looked at. And then also a couple of questions from the audience. Maybe we can do it alternatively. But the only way we can do it is if the questions are brief. And I would request the panel members who are answering to be also very brief. So the first question I'll take from the chat just to get the ball rolling. And it is from Melbourne, from Associate Professor Hemantha Doloy at the University of Melbourne. I hope he's still online. Can I pass it to Andreas? Andreas, because I know that you've done your PhD and you've been in Germany. So the question is, can the traditional PPP models applied in developed countries over the past decade be extended to developing countries? Shall I repeat it or did you get it?
No, thank you very much. It's clear. Yeah, thank you, Professor Hemantha Doloy. So very good question. I would like to respond this question based on our experience. That, to be honest, that applying the PPP concept or the FI model, if we use the term in the UK, is quite difficult when it comes to the social infrastructure projects, which is too often not full cost recovery. So there is now a discussion in Indonesia whether the availability-based payment, for instance, is a suitable option of a PPP project to the social infrastructure projects, because based on my study, for instance, that if the PPP project, the expected cost of PPP project is about 9 to 15% more expensive than the traditional procurement. So the question is actually for the government, what does the government expect from the private sector? Whether it is to fill the gap of financing or efficiency gains, because these two interests do not usually go together. So that is the main problem. If it comes to the economic infrastructure project, especially in toll roads, I think it's quite okay for us to apply what the model perform in the developed countries. But the question is, how can we apply the PPP model for social infrastructure projects? That's my response to the question from Associate Professor Dole from University of Melbourne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. That was short, sweet, and to the point. Thank you. So let's ask the audience to please raise your hand if anyone has a question, and ask it in 1 or 2 sentences, please. And you can direct it to a particular panel member, or you can ask it in general. Anyone wants to start from the audience? After all, we had one from Melbourne, so maybe someone has something in mind. Okay, while you're thinking, gone. So going over to back to the, okay, there is a question from chat, which is from a Sri Lanka-based guy. And if I'm not mistaken, it's someone you know, Deepal, Mr. Jayasena. I think he was involved with procurement, right? I have not met him. What is the basis of selection of, sorry, Yongjian. Okay. What is the basis of selection of PPP-able projects? Sorry, that's the word I used. PPP-able, because I said you got to distinguish between what is good for PP and what is not good. So he's asking, what is the basis of selecting those projects good for PPP, PPP-able, like bankable, under the new mechanism, referring to China, which he spoke about?
Yep. This time, the Chinese government actually made a very explicit answer. Only projects with operational income that can use user pay mechanisms will be considered. All other projects, for example, like social infrastructure projects that do not charge directly from end users and do not have operational income, will not be excluded, not considered. My personal note is the key is in business case, local government do not make financial commitments. That will be the key for upper government to approve it as a PPP. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Yongjian. I mean, you've matched Andreas in short and sweet and to the point.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay,
Chanaka.
I think that's a very good question.
Can he be heard online? Yes, okay. So you may not see, but it's Chanaka De Silva PC, who's going to give us his viewpoint from his experience in Sri Lanka. Go ahead, Chanaka.
Every infrastructure project is not suitable for a PPP project. I'll give you a very simple example. If you look at the port, in order to construct a port, you need a breakwater. But you also have terminal infrastructure, the quays. You can't do a breakwater on a PPP basis because there is no return. The return is long-term. The return is more national in the sense. But if you have a terminal, the terminal can be run as a business. That is capable of being done on a PPP basis. So even in Colombo, when we built the South Port in Colombo, the breakwater was done by the government through ADB financing, direct financing. But the terminals, there are 4 terminals which are planned. Terminals are coming through private investment.
Thank you. Okay, back to the live audience. So is anyone alive? Want to ask a question? Live question? Yes, someone? Okay, while you're deciding, Alan Mossman, who's now based in France, has asked a question. Well, he's asked a couple of questions. Alan, I don't know whether you're there, but a couple of general questions. But one, I think, is directed at me because, again, it's based on something I said in introducing. So I will take it up while we are waiting for a live question. The question is this. He's putting us on the spot, academics. So I hope you can join me in answering it later. But for now, I will try my best. Alan asked, if it is so easy for public sector to make, Akin, you can help me out after I finish. If it is so easy for public sector to make a case to use PPP and so easy for private sector to milk PPP, right? Why are academics continuing to examine PPP? Thank you, Alan. Being an academic, you're putting us on the spot.
Can I?
Akin, you want to start?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. If we are not doing this, we won't know some of these questions you are asking. It will not be known at all. One of the areas we are looking at, we've looked at a lot, is around the risk involved in terms of the risk premium. How do you model those risks? What are the models available? And also even the development of the business model is something that is coming from the amount of work we do. I think it gives opportunity for us to be able to audit the situations, and also for us to be able to expose some of those challenges that we do have. It's not every PPP project, it's already mentioned, it's not every PPP project that is bad, really. There's premium to be paid for the risk that the private sector is taking. And how do you determine that level of risk and the premium? And that is where we come in terms of the research that we do. Obviously, there will continue to be people who are willing to take opportunities that are available and also to be able to abuse that particular business model. But for us as academics, it's for us to be able to look into that, do research into the right business model that will be fit for purpose. And that is what we do, definitely.
Thank you, Akin. So if I can add my 2 cents, I was going to say again in that one slide that I put up for introduction, what I said there, maybe I can expand on that. I mean, there are weaknesses in the private sector, maybe lack of expertise in certain technologies, in certain management systems, in managing new types of projects, which might be there in the private sector. And vice versa, the public sector will have the resources, they will command, the commanding heights of the economy, as they say, which they can mobilize in terms of human resources, in terms of land. And so they bring those strengths and the weaknesses to the table. And it's about building those strengths, synergizing those, making them bigger than the sum of the parts, and compensating for the weaknesses of the other. So that would not work if it's just a public sector or just a private sector. So I think Chanaka talked about, the risk sharing, which is very at the core of PPPs, at the core of any contract for that matter, any construction contract. I mean, how do you share the risk? It should be very clear to start with. Otherwise, lawyers have more work, right? So it should be, you cannot define every risk, but it should be very clearly put as much as possible. And whether it should be equitable or not, as long as it's clear, there's a question. If it is known that you're going to assume the risk, you're supposed to price for it. So risk, shedding the risk totally to the private sector is not the purpose of PPPs, right? It's about judicious sharing. Each party bears what he can bear easily. So we're almost at the end of the 15 minutes that I asked for. Okay, last chance to the live audience. Anyone has a question? Yeah, Dr. Rohan Karnaratna.
My question goes to Mr. Chanaka. Chanaka, now supposing if the government is getting only one unsolicited proposal on a project, It's only one. So they are putting a panel to evaluate that. So I have also been in one of those panels. So we have given our report that some rates are 2-3 times high, some are 2 times high, or something like that. But as we have only given that report, so maybe the total project is 3 times higher than what comparing with the local rates. But just after we give the reports, the project had been started by that particular party and it has finished. Even still now it's still a white telephone project. So what is the legal situation of those kind of things? How do they do that?
Now, this is really the very reason why I said that we need to have proper procedures for evaluation and implementation, right? We do have. The 1998 guidelines are there. And the 1998 guidelines has a section which deals with how unsolicited proposals are to be handled, but it's a brief one. This was actually articulated more in detail in what was called the Swiss challenge process. Now, what was really discussed was in the, I can't remember exactly what that provision was, but I'll give you in substance what it says. If you have it, analyze it, and if possible, try and get others to bid. And give the opportunity to the person who made the first bid to better his bid, which is reasonable. But then the criticism of that is, well, if you do that, people might get discouraged to come forward and present unsolicited proposals. Then you might actually be discouraging unsolicited. That is by itself not a bad idea, right? We don't want every project to be unsolicited, right? We want only the good ones to go. And if your project is good, you will be there, right? So it is not bad to do that process. That's number one. Number two, even assuming you don't do that, the government still has an obligation under its public trust obligations to negotiate properly and get projects of this nature into the country, and the government can't run away from it, right? Now, that is where the problem is. And whether you go through an unsolicited proposal or a tender which is fixed and you know that it happens, right? It's the same result. You have an undesirable project or an undesirable contract going forward. And that is what needs to be controlled. So the fact that you don't have a guideline or the fact that you have not prohibited it is not really the solution. It is a question of when you get it, how do you deal with it? There must be a process laid down. And even if there is no process, you should look at it very clearly, right? And the fact is, unfortunately, very often that is not done. And you end up with projects which you should not be dealing with.
Thank you, Chanaka. Is there a follow-up or no? Okay, I do have a follow-up on that, Chanaka. So I'm going to ask another question on the same lines. In fact, it was in my mind while you were talking. I mean, okay, we entertain the unsolicited proposals, but you mentioned the word I wanted to Swiss challenge, the term. So the first part of the question is, don't other countries have established procedures for unsolicited proposals? And the second part is a stupid layman's question coming from me is, I mean, isn't the first part referring to something where if an unsolicited proposal is given, we can have a precondition. If you give an unsolicited proposal, it will be opened up to competition from others. But of course, we build in some sort of benefit to the guy who initiated it. If we were not in a tender process, I don't know what happened with the example you gave. That's a very interesting one, but let's not go into that. But if we give a benefit to the unsolicited proposal, but tell them, the proposer, it is a condition. If you are giving an unsolicited proposal, you must be prepared subject to a benefit you will get, which we can talk about later over dinner. I mean, not the people, I mean, you and I. Otherwise, it amounts to something else. So can you give a condition like that, Chanaka?
The benefit that was contemplated in the Swiss challenge process that we had and in the 1998 guidelines essentially is to say you have the ability of improving your bid, right? You can improve on and match it or improve it beyond. And I think that is a sufficient ability because you have come up with the proposal anyway, right? So in those circumstances, if you give those people the ability to match or the ability to do better, then that should be fine, right? So in an unsolicited proposal, actually two aspects arise. When you get an unsolicited proposal, the first question is it a project that we really want? Because very often, these are projects that you have never even contemplated, right? So your first question is, do you really need this infrastructure project? The answer may be no, right? Then the second question is, if so, at what price? What is it that we have to pay? And I can remember in the early days, there was a refinery which came into Hambantota, where the party was basically saying, we are going to put a refinery in Hambantota, and we are going to export all the production. And having exported all the production, in order to make this project viable, we must sell electricity to the country at 7 US cents per unit, right? That's the capacity charge. Variable charge is different, right? They also said we are going to be hiring 4,500 people, and people like to hear these words about big employment numbers. And they were going to set up a state-of-the-art facility. So there was a procurement committee appointed to look at that. And the procurement committee's simple analysis was, if this is a state-of-the-art facility, why do you need 4,500 people to run it? The Indonesian one, which had come very recently, comparable numbers, the number of staff was 450. What are they going to do with 4,500 people? Number one. Number two, at that time, we had closed our first power project. The price was 605. That was high. The question is, why are we paying 7? When we are not even getting the petroleum into the country and it's being exported, we are subsidizing them. And the numbers were done, and the subsidy that we were paying annually would be used to pay 2,500 rupees to every human being in the southern region, right, at that time, right? So this was put into a small report, and that was the end of the project, right? So unsolicited, I think it was not a proper project which was required by the country at that stage. So that is the type of analysis that has to go into it. Now, if you do that, then you see what the benefit is and not. So if we apply that other principle, you can, of course, ask people to bid it. And if the others come with a better number, tell him, okay, now you bid, you match it, right? So that's one thing that we could do.
Thank you, Chanaka. Thank you very much. Actually, this is, we spent some time on it, but it is, as I said, in the IMF report on Sri Lanka in 2023, which may be the latest report. I don't know, you can tell me if there's a 2024 report available to the public. But that's what I saw in the page 61 about the PPPs that came on unsolicited. And then they did the cost comparison, and there were reports from the Auditor General and the Attorney General, both criticizing what happened on a particular project. They named the project, I won't name it here, but they named the project. If you want, you can go and read it in a particular sector. So may I ask Nissanka, how, I mean, seeing that even IMF has pointed out this, the bad parts of unsolicited proposal, and Chanaka has made a good case for the good parts, and I see both sides. So we need a mechanism to entertain unsolicited proposals in an equitable way where the country can benefit, but not leaving out the competition. How to make them competitive while still giving a benefit to the guy who gave us the idea, the unsolicited proposer. Nissanka, do you want to give a point of view from the construction side or your personal point of view on that? Because I think the project that Chanaka referred to in Hambantota is one of the 4 you quoted, if I'm not mistaken, but forget about that. In general, what is the point of view, from a construction point of view, how should you deal with unsolicited proposals? Quick answer, please.
Yeah, I would like to make 2 points. One is in the IMF diagnostic report 2023, they have strongly urged to adopt a public procurement law for Sri Lanka. They have pointed out the drawbacks of the present system, and they are proposing to have a public procurement law. Then about these unsolicited bids, I know in 2018 proposed guideline, which was never approved, there was a section for Swiss challenge process, but it was never approved or adopted. But I know in some countries, especially I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Ghana, what they do is when an unsolicited proposal is received, based on that, they will call RFP and request competitive bids. But of course, they'll give a weightage to the proposer of the unsolicited bid. So that system is being adopted there. So maybe we can not to discourage unsolicited bids and also to have some competition and transparency. We can adopt a system similar to that.
Thank you, Nissanka. That's exactly what I was saying in too many words. You said it very short and sweet again. So yeah, if we can have something like that, that'll be great. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of this session, which has taken longer than the organizers planned. But I hope it was worth it for those who were here and listened, and also people who are online and who are still online. Thank you very much for joining, everyone, the participants. And we hope that you have got enough information to, to inspire you to look further into PPPs. And just for information, a video recording of this session, the panel discussion, that's including the presentations and the Q&A, will be available on the symposium website. So thank you, and thank you to the organizers for tolerating the time overrun without any penalties. Thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Mohan Kumaraswamy, and all the distinguished moderators and the esteemed panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience to illuminate the 12th World Construction Symposium 2024. So it's a privilege to have the on-site panelists as well as the moderators. So it is our responsibility to appreciate the input of these esteemed panelists and the moderators. So to present the token of appreciation, I graciously invite Dr. Rohan Karunaratne, President, Ceylon Institute of Builders. Please, sir, can you come on stage, please? First, I call upon our esteemed panelist, Engineer Nissanka Wijeratne. Next, Mr. Chanaka De Silva, President Council. Please remain on stage. Please give a round of applause. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Rohan Karunaratne, joining with us. So next, I cordially invite Mr. Rohan De Silva, Vice President, Ceylon Institute of Builders, to present the token of appreciation. I call upon stage our distinguished moderators, Professor Mohan Kumaraswamy. So please remain on stage. Mr. Rohan. Next, I call upon Dr. Suranga Jayasena. Thank you. And also, I would like to thank the online speakers who have joined with us, the panelists, for their immense contribution. So we are privileged to have them, even not on site, but their online presence was great for us. So as Professor Mohan Kumaraswamy informed, so the online panelists has to visit Sri Lanka to collect their token of appreciation.